Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome back, and actually, welcome to the very first training session for level 3 of this training. And we're so happy to have Crystal with us from the Center of Open Science, and she will be giving us about 3 sessions about teaching about open scholarship. So thank you very much, Crystal, for giving us your time and your effort. And we cannot wait to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about something that's really near and dear to my heart. It's teaching about open scholarship. A little bit about me, in case it's helpful to know. My background's in community psychology, which is a kind of a small subsection of psychology that has a lot of overlap with sociology, public health, all of that. We focus a lot on prevention and intervention of different health issues and community issues and mental health. And so I got into open science because there was a lot of movement about 10 years ago, I guess, within psychology, a lot of people getting caught having done stuff that they shouldn't have been doing with data, and writing about those experiences. And I thought it was really fascinating to just see how all of this was affecting kind of the academic ecosystem. And so I've been involved with open science since about 2015 or 2016. And I've mostly focused on, because I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I do qualitative and quantitative. And so I've actually largely focused on the qualitative side of things, although I also, since in my role as training and education manager for the Center for Open Science, I also teach about a lot of the quantitative side of open scholarship as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys think about the kinds of training that you might think about doing within your communities. The things that you are excited about, the things that you are worried about. I hope that we can have, a nice conversation. I have some slides. They have some information on them. I did provide the slides on the Center for Open Science, so the Open Science Framework. So there's a link that should have gone to your email so you could request access. I know several of you already have, but if you haven't yet, go back to that email and, you'll be able to access these slides, and also a thing that we'll be using actually next week as well. If you need the link to that, I can provide it after this as well. And if folks have questions about how to get access to the project and stuff, just let me know. I'm happy to talk about that more. But let's dive in. So we're going to, over the course of this module, of these 3 weeks, we're going to talk about identifying relevant open scholarship practices for your community, explaining why open scholarship is relevant to your community. And community here can mean a couple of different things. It could be an academic community, like your field. It could be your department. It could be the region that you're in. I'm using the word community kind of as a catch-all for any group of people who might be interested in talking about open scholarship. We'll also talk about developing measurable learning objectives, how to adapt course materials to suit the needs of that community, and then measuring the learning of your community. So today we're going to talk about those first 3 things, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of casual homework. I'm not going to grade it or anything, but I'm going to give you a task to complete by next week. And then we'll actually use what you developed over that week to talk through it more. So that 4th item, adapting course materials, we'll talk about next week. And then the last week, we'll talk about measuring the learning of your community. And so throughout this, I do have the chat open. So feel free to, if you have questions, you can pop in this chat, or you can raise your hand and we can stop and talk about it. I hear myself talk a lot, so I'm happy to hear other folks chat, or to see questions in the chat, so we don't have to listen to me talk the whole time. But one of the questions that I often get is, can't I just make a training and give it and then just see who shows up, right? And I think actually a lot of trainings are kind of developed with this in mind. I have a thing that I would like to talk about, so I'm going to throw some slides together. I'm going to maybe host a webinar. I'm going to go to my department, and then I'm just going to talk at people for a while. And we'll just see who shows up. Whoever's interested is going to show up, and that'll be fine. And that certainly is one way that you can do a training. You can just make your items and just kind of see who shows up and they get what they get out of it. But that training, if you do it that way, that might not actually match what your audience needs, right? It could be too advanced, right? You could be talking at a level that's way beyond what they're prepared to talk about. It could also be too basic. Maybe you're giving an introduction to open scholarship, but this community's been engaged with open scholarship in a while. They don't want to know about what open scholarship is. They want to know how to do it, or they want to know a specific thing about one of the practices. So it could be that, the level at which you're talking at doesn't quite match what the audience needs from you. It could also be misaligned philosophically. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm a mixed methods researcher. One of the things that I hear a lot from qualitative researchers is, okay, all the stuff that you're focusing on with quantitative research around reproducibility and about replication and stuff, that doesn't really apply to us. Like the way that we do research, it doesn't really fit into that framework. And so if you don't get the chance to know your audience a bit better, you could run into an issue where you're speaking kind of past them in a lot of ways. And so that can also make it to where it's seen as irrelevant to them. So they tune out pretty quickly because they're like, this actually isn't, I don't need this. It's not useful to me. Maybe it doesn't align with my philosophy. So I'm just going to ignore it. And I think that that's then a lost opportunity, either to explain how what you're talking about is relevant to that community, or to develop your materials and to learn about that community a bit more so that you can talk to them in a way that makes sense. And so then that does lead to the question of, how do I know what my community cares about? There are a lot of different ways that we learn about communities, right? We can go to conferences and we can see, like, what are these presentations about that people are talking about? What's happening in the breaks, right? Between sections, what are people talking about? And actually, I find that talking to people in those break sessions actually sometimes is a little bit more helpful, more fruitful than even the presentations themselves, because we kind of put up a front in a lot of ways whenever we're speaking to an academic audience, right? We have things that are expected for us to say, but it's in those breaks where you hear people say things like, oh, I tried to replicate that study like 100 times and couldn't get it to work or whatever. And then you can start to hear some of those things that they're worried about. You can also look at the literature, right? People write commentaries and other things. They write guides. You can kind of see, like, what are issues that people focusing on. And then you might also be in a research group yourself. So what's coming up in lab meetings, right? What issues are you running into in your lab? All of these are ways that you can kind of informally get information from people. You can also start to think about, okay, if I'm a researcher or I'm an educator, or I'm playing this particular role in my community, what skills does someone need to succeed in my role? And are these the skills that are often discussed? Right. One of the things that I learned, I don't know what grad school is like in Africa, but in the US, at least it's been changing. But I would often talk to my professors, and they would talk about how when they were coming up, if they were told to teach a class, they kind of were given a book 2 weeks before the class started, and they'd be like, here you go, you can teach this class in 2 weeks. So they would have to have 2 weeks to pull together all of the materials that they need to teach a class. That may or may not be in their expertise area, that they may or may not be excited about. But that was their assignment as a graduate student, was to teach this class. They weren't taught about how to teach other people. They weren't taught about what activities might be helpful for students. They weren't talked about, they didn't, how to put together a presentation, all of that. They weren't taught any of that. That is changing in graduate school training in the US, where we do start to see, folks getting enrolled in seminars and stuff to teach. But that's something that isn't explicitly discussed as something that a graduate student needs to be able to do in order to succeed. We don't talk necessarily about, we want them to be able to teach, to be able to talk to other people about a certain topic and help them understand it. We see a lot of that in research too. We don't necessarily explicitly talk about organizational skills. or documentation skills. We talk about the specific steps of an experiment or the specific things around data analysis, right? But maybe we don't talk about data cleaning. So it might also sometimes just be helpful to sit back and say, okay, if I want to succeed in my role, what do I need to be able to do that? And what do others need to be able to succeed in their role? And even if that's something that isn't explicitly mentioned in a job ad or anything like that. It's also really important that you're interested in the thing that you're teaching about. There are things that I don't teach about unless I absolutely need to, because it's not as interesting to me. I can't get people excited about it. And so it might be helpful to think about, what am I interested in teaching people about? What do I feel like I know? What do I feel like that I could really help somebody learn a skill in this area? And I know for some of you, you may be still really new to the idea of open scholarship. You may be thinking about, maybe I haven't done a replication yet. Can I actually teach someone about replication if I haven't done one yet? The answer is that you can, and that there are ways that you can kind of help. And actually, sometimes you're actually in a better position than somebody who's maybe done like 1,000 replications. That might be a bit high, but somebody that's done a whole lot of replications, we'll talk about this in a bit, but sometimes you also being in a position where you're learning is actually beneficial to the people that you're teaching as well. And then of course you can also just directly ask people for input. So you can go to your department or you can go to your lab and say, hey, I really want to do a training on open scholarship practices. What questions do you guys have? What concerns you? What interests you? And so it's totally fine to do that. You can directly ask people, you can send out surveys, but you can also just informally talk to people. And so your training then is going to be a mix of your expertise, the things that you know how to do, the community need, what skills are needed within this community, how can we build that capacity to do good work, and then also your own interest. All of these things go into making a training, and all of these things help to make a training to be as good as it could be. So I'm curious, and folks can come off mute or they can type in the chat. In thinking about your own, you've gone through 2 levels of training so far in open scholarship. You're about to go through your 3rd level. What are some things that get you excited about training open scholarship practices or values or principles? What are you interested in maybe developing some trainings on?
Yeah, so I think even if someone cannot unmute, you can still type in the chat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and while people are preparing their answers, hopefully, I want to say that I could relate so much to the previous slide that you were saying, is that uh, I was a lecturer, and for example, now, just last week, I was suddenly told that I need to supervise students in a whole research project, and I haven't done that before, and I wasn't given any guide to do that, which is really unfortunate. And even when I started teaching, I was never told how to prepare slides, or most importantly, how to evaluate students, which is, to be honest, very sad. And I really hope that this would change in the near future for us.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that experience. It is such a common one, and I think especially the evaluation part is often we don't really get taught how to grade things. We just get told, here, give a test out or have them write an essay. But there are things that make grading easier and better for students and more helpful for students, but we don't really get taught that. So thanks for sharing that. Do others have thoughts? It's also entirely reasonable to say I'm not sure yet. So if that's where people are at, that's also totally fine. Promoting open science? Yeah.
And I think this questions also bridge back to what you said, is that maybe some of us feel that we're not ready yet because we're not expert in a topic. But I would like to say that for the trainees now, I think you already have so much more knowledge than the average African scholar about open science. Yeah, so you're more than prepared to do that.
Yeah, and that interest part is, I think, going to be key, right? So, if you're interested, we're hearing some folks in the chat saying, I'm interested in promoting open science. So like that interest, hold on to that interest. That'll help to guide some of the work that you'll be doing after you're done with this training. And we're also seeing stuff around, writing research, like funding proposals. That's an important skill to be able to train other folks in. We're seeing stuff around open access and information literacy, right? All of these are things that having that interest in that helps to provide you that first step in getting to, okay, here's the thing that I'm going to train about. So thanks everyone for sharing. I know it's like really awkward, especially at the beginning, to be like, oh, I'm not entirely sure what I want to do yet. I'm definitely not going to hold you to it. Interests change over time as well. But I'm glad that folks are really thinking about like what it is that they're wanting to be able to share with other people. So thank you for sharing. It is, and let's talk for a minute about expertise. It is really helpful to know what your audience's expertise is. There are kind of three levels that I think about expertise, and the first is like a novice. So this is someone that's completely new to a topic. They don't yet know even what they don't know, right? So they don't know what the key ideas are in the domain or how those things relate to one another. Maybe they've heard the term open science. Maybe they've heard open access, but they don't know if those two things are related to one another, or they might think that they're the same thing. A colleague of mine just had this experience. She went to a conference in virology recently, and she was asking folks, that were at the conference, like, do you engage in open science practices? And then folks responded to her, well, I publish my research in journals. And so to them, they didn't really have this like grasp of like what open science is or what open access might mean, right? So she found herself like having to like navigate. She thought that folks would be a little bit further in understanding what open science meant, but they were actually in this kind of novice stage where they're still learning what all the terms are. They're learning how they relate to one another and how do they relate to their own research or not. You also get some folks that are competent practitioners. So they can do kind of the everyday work. Maybe they know a little bit about data management, right? They can clean a data set. Maybe they can write a data management and sharing plan. They have some of these basic ideas, but they don't quite have specific knowledge for particular instances. So if we're thinking about data management, maybe they have like general, like if somebody fills out a survey, I know how to clean that data, I know how to share it. But maybe they don't have expertise in sensitive data, for instance, or in patient, I personally identifying information. Maybe there are specific use cases where they don't necessarily know, but they know enough that they can kind of pass through those kinds of everyday circumstances. And then you have experts, right? So these are folks that somebody tells you, I need to write a data management and sharing plan for particularly sensitive qualitative data. Maybe this person doesn't handle qualitative data, but they know where to look. They know where to look. They know how to read that material, to pick it up, to be able to apply it, and right away. So these aren't discrete categories. It's kind of on a spectrum. There may be some areas where you feel like you're a novice, and there may be other areas where you feel like you're an expert. And then a lot of times most people kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And so knowing what your audience's expertise is can be really, really helpful in honing that training to be what you need it to be. Because you don't want it to be, if someone's an expert and they're wanting to know, I want to know how to do in very, very specific things, giving them that novice level training is not going to help. And so there is a question too around dealing with trainees who, act like they know too much, and maybe they have a lot of criticism in the class. Um, I have struggled with this before, or I've had students, that have done this before, where maybe they had a previous class that taught them some of the basics, and maybe you're teaching them now. Um, I think there are a couple of different strategies that can be helpful. I often kind of take a sort of a relational perspective. So if I notice that, especially if it's in like a classroom setting, there's somebody that maybe is trying to answer all of the questions, or maybe they have commentary on everything, and that commentary is not necessarily helpful. I try to relate to the fact that maybe the student feels like they're not being challenged enough. And so it depends on exactly how, like if they're being belligerent or if they're just kind of being a little bit sarcastic. But I try to kind of acknowledge that, like, it sounds like you know a lot on this already. That's just really excellent. I think at some point I might ask you for, a couple of, a couple of questions that I have myself, kind of appealing to the fact that they do feel like they're an expert in this arena, but also like maybe recognizing that, but there are a lot of folks here who haven't heard this yet. So um, sometimes addressing it that way. So you're kind of appealing to the fact that you do have expertise in this area, even if sometimes they may not actually have expertise in the area, but you're kind of appealing to that. It's often a little bit of an ego thing where you're like, it sounds like you know a lot. I'm really grateful for having you here. Maybe during discussion, this could be really interesting. But for now, I'm just trying to make sure I'm trying to get everybody caught up to speed so that we're all talking at the same level. And that usually works, at least in my experience. When folks are a little bit more belligerent, then I think you kind of have to have a classroom management sort of strategy where you might even consider where somebody may not, I hope it doesn't ever get this bad, but where it may be helpful to talk to that student afterwards and saying like, hey, let's level set here, and kind of like here's the engagement rules that we expect to have. You're kind of breaking them. It's making students uncomfortable, and I'm talking about this mostly in terms of students, but this also works for I think a training. And then lastly, actually, one thing that you could do kind of on the prevention side is setting those ground levels, at the beginning of a training, which I probably should have done here, where, somebody may feel like, hey, some of you may have already heard some of this stuff, right? I'm just trying to make sure that everybody's speaking at the same level once we get into the discussion portions, setting those kind of ground rules for engagement, and how people can talk to one another. So that can also head off some of that at the beginning too, because then people can kind of realize like, oh, there may be people like in this training that don't actually get where we're at right now. And so that sometimes can help. But I often find trying to engage experts and kind of bring them into the fold, maybe help them kind of feel like almost like a teaching assistant can help to mitigate some of that, if they're feeling a little bit tense. Yeah, Alanis.
Yeah, I actually wanted to twist Modester's question a bit, and because I think uh, when we're going to talk about open science to our communities, there are definitely going to be those who are against it,
Mhm.
fully against it, and they try to sabotage the training and like start saying, oh, this is nonsense, or the system has been working fine for me, why would we change it? So how would you usually handle situations like that, or how do you think it could be handled?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I run into this in the past, it's often been, um, I often try to relate because it's kind of funny that people will say things like, oh, the system's been working for me. And then I usually have some examples that I can pull out of my pocket where I'm like, so this worked for you then? Like this has worked for you? And then like getting them to kind of question that assumption, like just because the system's in place doesn't mean that it's working for people. And I think often within a scientific setting, talking about like, so for instance, if I'm talking to people about pre-registration, right? Sometimes people are like, we don't need pre-registration. you know, whatever. And so they have this list of arguments for why they don't think pre-registration is helpful, and we don't need this, and journals are dumb for including it. And so then I asked them, so you must have had really amazing review experiences. No one's ever asked you to completely change your analysis plan and to run a bunch of analyses that weren't really relevant to your hypothesis. That's never happened to you. And almost every scientist at some point has gotten some feedback from a reviewer where somebody says, well, you should rerun your entire model with these variables included instead, right? And it's such a waste of time, because that's not the study that you did. And so like kind of appealing to those things that aren't working around the system. You've never had funding rejected for something that you felt was really minor. You've never struggled to replicate a study. You've never had that problem. You've never had that problem of getting a paper accepted for review. And so like being able to show like with examples and asking them to relate to that, this is working for you then, like that you've never had this problem, because most of the time they have had this problem. And so, and you know, and you can also, you don't have to target that person specifically. They may feel like they're being attacked, but you could say like show of hands in the room, how many people have gotten a study published like 5 years after it's done? And you know, a lot of times people's hands will go up, right? Or 2 years or whatever. You don't have to use 5. And then say like how many people wish that they could get a hold on up-to-date research faster, right? Most people in the room are going to raise their hands. So then you can say, well, preprints help with that, right? So you can kind of target it to what are the actual benefits of that practice are there, and seeing like what the temperature of the room is, because what we found through a variety of different surveys is that people do have these complaints. They find studies hard to replicate, right? They feel like the research process is too slow and they're not getting access to high quality research fast enough. They're not getting their research out fast enough, and that's impacting their ability to meet their performance goals. And so like when you're able to appeal to that, if you can know like here's what the culture is and here's what people wish could change, and you can kind of bring that into it. And that has been pretty successful for me, in the sense that, you know, oftentimes I don't know if it necessarily changes that person's mind, and that doesn't have to be your goal in that instance. Um, your goal in that instance is just to let you talk sometimes. And so that often helps, because they can kind of see like, oh, in this room, most people are mad that they can't get access to research faster, or that they have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to be able to access an article for 48 hours, right? And no one has the budget for that. Or that, you know, Nature wants $12,000 or whatever so that they can publish their work open access. Most people are upset about that. And that sometimes helps to reset because it's really easy to get wrapped up in what you think. And so I have found that like being able to say, the people in this room want to hear about this because they are experiencing these issues, and you have also experienced these issues, more than likely. That tends to help, because it just helps to reset people's frame where they're like, okay, maybe I should listen. It doesn't always work, and sometimes you can just kind of say this person is not here for this, and that's fine. I should focus on the people who are interested. And that I think comes with experience of navigating a classroom or a training setting. But what I actually have found is, this also can vary by group, is oftentimes the folks that aren't really interested, if it's like a mandatory training, they just kind of tune out. And so that is unfortunate, and you can try to bring them in. But also you can't force someone to learn. So really thinking also about, what do I have experience in? What do I have comfort in? What is my own teaching style? And also like, what can I actually control? I cannot control whether this person is doodling in their notebook or not. I can try to engage them. I can try to bring them in, but you can't make somebody learn. So that also I think plays a big part of it as well. So hopefully that's helpful as folks are kind of thinking through, you know, how do I engage with my audience, or how do I think through, most of the time I think people are going to show up to a training that's not mandatory because they're interested in the topic. Very rarely does somebody come because they think it's stupid and they want to ruin your life, although those people exist. a lot of times where I see more issue is when something's a part of a mandatory training. You get a wider range of people who are interested to not interested in a topic. Most people will just not come if they don't have to and they're not interested. So hopefully that
Uh,
helps to settle for folks that might have questions. Yeah, I heard
yeah,
some.
I'm really afraid to take so much of the time of the training, but there is one thing that I wanted to put in
Yeah.
is that I don't know how it works in the global north, but in the global south, unfortunately, if that someone who's problematic is sort of higher up in administration or, have powers, it would be a disaster trying to sort of challenge them and it could make you lose your job, and it could eventually, like, if other people in the room are convinced that what you're saying is right, they would sort of side up with that person
Mhm.
because they don't want to lose their jobs. So this is also a big issue, I think, that we have in Africa, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one way that I have found, because I've also run into that, if you can find an ally that is at a similar level to them or even higher than them, that could also help to level set. So I have actually done this, I did this as a grad student. Having that, say, the department head come in to the beginning of the training and saying, this is so important. I'm glad that Crystal's here and that she's going to talk about this. I think that this is something that we should really pay attention to. Sometimes having that authority behind you can be really helpful. I think also sometimes you don't have to like duke it out with somebody, but you can I think sometimes navigate that if you know that person well enough, you can sometimes navigate that to where again, you're trying to draw them in and bring them in. But if authority is a concern, I think sometimes having that person, or sometimes I also realize like maybe I'm not the person that needs to give the training, but maybe I can bring someone else in. So I've also had it where I've co-presented with people who are maybe external to the department, but they're a bigger name, or they have an organization behind them that's very prestigious, or I've just straight up asked somebody else if they'd be willing to come in, because maybe sometimes this is also a department dynamic where people will take ideas as long as it's not from somebody in the department. But if somebody from an organization they respect or somebody from a big name school comes in and gives a guest talk, right, and says, hey, this is a really important topic, then that can lay the groundwork for you to come in afterwards as well. So building a network of support, building finding allies, particularly ones that have some prestige behind them, can also be really helpful if authority is kind of an issue. So hopefully that's also helpful. Um, and when we think about, I think this kind of ties into this idea, right, of our own expertise and our own potential blind spots. I mentioned this before, like experts often they're so familiar with their subject area, right, that it's really hard for them to imagine what it's like to not understand something. I would be shocked if there was somebody here today that has not experienced this in real time, perhaps in a classroom setting or at a training or even a presentation at a conference where the person talking, you can tell they know what they're talking about, but for the life of you, you cannot follow what they're talking about because they're talking at a level that is above you. And so sometimes experts, they're so familiar with that topic that they cannot envision what it is like to be in their audience, to be new to this entirely. And so if you are an expert in a particular topic, um, it's really important to listen to learners, to hear what their questions are and to address those. And also, you might seek out any less expert colleagues. So I've done this before when I talk about positionality statements and stuff that are really specific to qualitative. I'll actually have a friend that maybe kind of knows what a positionality statement is or kind of knows a particular qualitative method, and I'll say, hey, can you check through my slides? Like what comes up? And we actually do this within the Center for Open Science as well. We'll bring in people who kind of know what something is, but they're not they're not an expert in it, like, maybe like I am, or like Leslie is, or like Daniel is, and we'll say, hey, can you take a look at this and like let me know, are there words here that don't make sense? Are there questions that come up for you? Is there anything that's on here that's just worded in a way where you're like, and so you seek out those less expert colleagues, and you get their advice, and you get their feedback. And so let me go back here. So don't be terrified if you're not an expert in a topic. Like I said, I kind of hinted at this at the beginning. Not being an expert can actually sometimes put you in a position of privilege in a way, because you understand what it's like to still be learning something. You understand what it's like to have questions. And you probably also understand what it's like to be nervous to ask those questions. And so you can anticipate some of the things that come up. You can anticipate some of the questions that people might have. And you can also probably think about like the trajectory and by which somebody should be learning something. So they need to understand the concept, they need to start being able to apply it, and so on and so forth. So you have this idea, and that actually puts you in an advantage. So even if you've never done a replication before, but you understand the replication process and you know where resources are, you can still do a training on replication. You can still talk to people about the importance of replication. You understand that, but you also understand what it's like for replication to be completely new. Maybe you even understand what it's like to not feel that great about replication, or whatever particular topic, right? And I think this also, matches for those of you who are thinking about, writing research proposals. Maybe you haven't successfully gotten a funded research proposal yet, but you know how to put one together. You know the instructions, you know how to follow them, you know the things that are important, but maybe you haven't yet had that funding hit the way that you've wanted to hit. You can still teach other people the basics of it. And actually, I have found personally that in teaching other people how to do stuff, I've actually learned how to do it better myself. Sometimes teaching other people is actually the best way to learn. So don't feel intimidated if you're not an expert. But if you are an expert, try to remember what it was like to learn about this stuff. And if it's really, really impossible for you to put yourself in that position, seek out somebody who would be learning about this and get feedback from them about what questions they have. And that can really help to strengthen your training as well. So in thinking about how you should talk about open scholarship specifically within a training, there are a number of different ways that you can address this. So one, you can focus on values. So you may have seen this in some of the trainings that you've taken in levels 1 and 2. Maybe people have talked about, we are scientists, right? We want to do good work. We want to expand the knowledge of the world. We want to help people. So you're really focusing on things that people value. They value transparency. They value being able to validate each other's work. They value openness. They value collaboration. You can appeal to these in a training by saying, like, these are the things that we value. Here's how open scholarship or open science or open research, whatever term it is that you use, matches those values. So you align their values with the values of open science, and make it so that they can easily see themselves, like why they would want to engage in those practices. You can also focus on problems. And so what I mean by that is, if we talk about registered reports, well, what are some of the problems with the scientific publishing process, right? It takes too long, you get feedback at a weird time, after you can actually do anything about any of their suggestions. You have to journal hop. Like, you can focus on these very practical problems that researchers have and talk about how open science can help to solve those problems. And you can also talk about evidence-based approaches. I think this is kind of the hardest one to do right now in open scholarship, because we're pretty early in our evaluation of whether these practices help or not, if they bring up any new issues. But to the extent that there is research out there that shows that replication leads to better outcomes, or that pre-registration leads to better outcomes, or that open access actually helps increase citation counts and all of these things, you can lean on that evidence as well, because we're probably mostly going to be talking to other researchers. We may talk to others, but we'll probably mostly be talking to other researchers. And researchers like to see evidence. So you don't have to stick to any one of these approaches. You might do a mixture of them. And in fact, that's probably the most effective way. But it is important to think about, what approach am I taking when I'm talking about these topics? And is this one appropriate for the audience that I'm talking about? So those are approaches that can be really helpful. And at the end of the day, right, we want to make it relevant. Why am I teaching you about this? That was weird. Sorry, something just fell off my wall. Why am I teaching you about this topic? And really saying, why would somebody show up to my training? What are they hoping to get out of it? So make it relevant to them, not just to you as a teacher. I could talk about a lot of things all day long, but I'm not going to, because that may not be what my audience is interested in. So why are they learning this? And I think it's also important to be open about pros and cons. So I really try to not evangelize about open science. I'm very excited about open science. I work for the Center for Open Science. I've been doing this for 10 years. I love open science and open scholarship, but I also recognize that people have concerns about certain open scholarship practices, right? I know that people are concerned about scooping. I know that people are concerned about the research process taking a long time. I know that people are, be open about those things so that you're not evangelizing, and so that you are being, and so you also help your audience to trust you, right? That you're not just telling them, here's what you should be doing, but you're also saying, yes, here are some things. Maybe in some circumstances, this particular practice is not right for you. That's okay. There are a lot of open scholarship practices. Find the ones that work for you and apply them. And so I think being really open about that and being willing to talk about criticisms and critiques, I think that's number one, that's very aligned with what we hope open science encourages. But the other thing is that it also just helps build a rapport, I think, with your audience, to acknowledge that some things are hard or that they might take a little bit longer to do, but it's worth it in the end if these are your goals. And then I also think, and this is actually particularly important to my role, sometimes when I give trainings, people think, oh, you want everybody to use the open science framework, right? Because that's an open scholarship tool. Open scholarship is not open scholarship tools. And what I mean by that is somebody could never touch the open science framework and still be an open scholar. That sucks for me. I mean, it doesn't really suck for me. My job doesn't depend on people using the OSF, but like I work for the Center for Open Science. We make the open science framework. But somebody can still engage in open science practices even if they're doing it slightly different than you. Maybe they're using GitHub, maybe they're not using GitHub, right? Maybe they do all of their stuff still in SPSS as opposed to any of the other tools that you might recommend in terms of data analysis. That's okay. You can help them to make their practices more open without saying you absolutely have to use this particular tool. Because I don't think that there is really an alignment there in terms of values between open scholarship and telling people that they have to do things in a very specific way or else they're doing it wrong. And so I'm curious to bring it back to you guys, in thinking about your own values and your own interests, even some of the things that you've been talking about, in chat in terms of what you're interested in teaching about. What is it about open scholarship that you find interesting? And again, you can unmute and talk, or you can use the chat, whatever makes you feel more comfortable. But what draws you to open science? What makes it interesting for you? And actually, for folks that are actually still that might want to type their answer out, I can also start for me. For me, I think access is so important. I think it's important for knowledge to be free. And so I try to integrate that into my work when possible. And I think that open scholarship allows us to share the process, not just the results of research. And I think that that's also really important. It's not just important that you understand the facts, so to speak, but also how those facts were obtained. And then you can navigate, that importantly. So it's not just about the results, but also about the process. So I'm seeing folks talk about collaboration, access, the spreading of knowledge. What else appeals to you about open scholarship?
I think also while people are typing, I could also go and answer. For me, it's actually being at the underprivileged end, being a researcher coming from a developing country, a country that had so many sanctions upon it that I had no control over, but it had control over my career. And at the same time, I'm expected to still be, produce scientific outcomes that could compete in the global arena. So I think this is what really made this a life mission for me, because I know how devastating it is to, as you said previously, Crystal, just to access a paper, you need to like pay $100, and my salary was $30 at that time. So this was next to impossible for me, and my institution did not provide access. Yeah, so this was my motives for being involved in open science.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It is really amazing like how much open scholarship, when applying well, can make it easier for people to access, regardless of their institution's fundings, regardless of their own funding. And I'm seeing kind of some similar stuff around, open research, open access, like how that can help with knowledge dissemination, how that can help with collaboration. I'm also seeing folks talk about integrity and honesty being really important values, and to know even just what research is going on, right? And so I think that these are all really good reasons to be interested in open scholarship, and I hope that you hold on to that interest as you're developing your own trainings, and other, not just, actually not even really just other training, but other advocacy practice. Like, training isn't the only form of advocacy in open scholarship that you can engage in. So, hold on to those things that make you excited about open scholarship, and use that while you're putting together any kind of initiative that you're interested in. I think it's also important because we can get very excited about what it is that we're talking about, that sometimes we can throw a whole lot at people and we can kind of overwhelm our audience. So we can throw just a whole bunch of information at them. And then at the end of the training, they're kind of like, well, what do I do now? Right? So it can be really helpful to give your audience one or two action items. So when I talk about data management, for instance, I often tell people, if you do nothing else from what we talk about today, get a good file naming system and implement it in one of your projects. Figure out how you want to name your files, pick a project, and do that. Or set up folders so that you have a structure for your project so you can organize it. And do that for one project. And if that project is still overwhelming to think about a project, say, okay, just do it for your data. Just take your files, your data files, and organize them, name them correctly, put them in folders as needed. Just do it for your data. And then you can pick another folder some other time, right? And organize that, all of your institutional ethics review documentation, right? Like, so breaking things down to one or two action items that they can do today is really helpful, to helping them feel empowered that they can actually engage in this, and also to help center them, because there is a lot of information during these trainings that kind of just flies at people. So they can center and say, okay, I can name my files. That is something I can do. And then let them try it. And also remember that each scholarship practice can be its own training or its own set of trainings. So when you're talking about what training you want to give to your audience, you in 2 hours are not going to be able to cover data management and sharing, collaborating on research projects, lab culture. You have 2 hours. And sometimes you have even less than that. Maybe you only have a half hour. So really think about what is reasonable for me to talk about within this time frame without smashing so much in that we can't talk about it. So you can always dive deeper, and you can always give people access to resources so that they can dive deeper, without overwhelming them. Don't introduce too much at once. Take it step by step. Remember what it's like to learn this stuff. Some of it's really complicated. Data management and sharing is very complicated. And I tell trainees that all the time when I teach about it. Like, I'm like, there's stuff that I still don't know about it. So, don't introduce too much, and don't jump way ahead into like the complex stuff. Start at that introduction, unless your audience already knows, maybe they already do data management fairly regularly and you want to dive into that more complex stuff. But don't introduce too much. Start at a level that they're going to feel comfortable at. And this is really, really, really important. I want you to consider what you want people to be able to do by the end of the training. Sometimes that's as simple as I want them to be able to define what replication is. I just want them to know what replication is. That's okay as a goal. But you want to focus on what they can do. So do you want them to be able to do a replication by the end of the training? That's very different than just being able to define it. And that leads us into developing measurable learning objectives. So here's where we're going to start talking a bit about something that I want you to do over the next week. You don't have to, again, do it formally. You can just jot it down on a piece of paper. But we're going to think about, and you're not tied to this, but as you're considering about a training that you might give hypothetically, or training you're actually planning on giving, we're going to talk about our own measurable learning objectives. So again, it's important what you want people to be able to do at the end of the training, but you also want to make sure that they feel like the training was worth their time and your own time, right? You're putting in a lot of time organizing this training, getting it ready, getting all of the information out there for people to be able to sign up and to come, right? You've put a lot of effort into this. So how do you make the training worth your time as well? Your time is also very valuable. You could be doing anything else, but you've chosen to do this. So how do you make that worth your time? There is a problem with a lot of learning objectives. I have some example learning objectives that I've often seen in workshops. And these are fairly standard, right? So learn about t-tests, understand the concept of bias, talk about strengths and weaknesses of developmental theories, become familiar with reflexive research practices, or develop an interest in geophysics. I'm curious if folks can pick up on why these might not be ideal learning objectives. Does anybody have any intuitions on this? It's okay if it's a complete guess, but why might these be kind of difficult? Too broad. Yeah. Too general. That's definitely one. Developing an interest in geophysics, like all of geophysics. You want somebody to just develop an interest in all of it, right? Or a t-test. What about t-tests do you want them to learn? Good. Any others? Not smart. Yeah. Okay. Good. We've got some that's specific, measurable, actionable. Actionable? Was that it? I think achievable. Oh, I'm forgetting what the RMAT stands for. And then time sensitive might be important. Yeah, they need to be broken down into actionable bits, right? Like, what does it mean to understand something? Right? It's not verifiable. These are hard to measure. How do you measure someone is familiar with something, right? These are not ideal learning objectives because they're too vague, they're too broad, and they're not measurable. And measuring, I'm using measurable here in a very, very broad sense. I don't mean that there has to be a number associated with it. It could just be like, can this person do this thing? Yes or no. But it's really hard to measure these. So many learning objectives are way too vague, right? As such as the ones that are up there. They're not measurable or observable, right? It's hard to actually know whether someone has done that thing. A lot of times we also see, and you couldn't tell this by looking at the ones on the last slide, but sometimes what's on the learning objectives doesn't actually map onto what people do in the workshop. So they want people to do stuff, but they're not actually integrating that into the training. And they also don't reflect what participants should be able to do after the workshop. So developing an interest in geophysics, to do what, right? To what end do you want somebody to develop an interest in geophysics? And then some of them are also beyond a trainer's control. You might be the best trainer in the entire world, but that person may still not be interested in the topic after you've taught about it, right? You can't control that. You can encourage it, you can set an environment by which that might happen, but you can't force someone to be interested in something. So that's beyond your control. Is it really fair to set that up as an objective for you if it's one that you can't attain? It doesn't make sense. And then some of them are also not actually about learning. So you can have training objectives, but learning objectives should primarily be about learning. Developing an interest in something is not learning. It might encourage them to learn, but it is not a learning objective. It does not mean that you can't have an objective that's not about learning, but it's not a learning objective. So some of you may have seen this before. I saw in the surveys, thanks again for those that filled that out. Some of you have taught folks before, so maybe you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. I find it a useful tool. I don't live or die by it, but I do think that it's helpful. And what that does is, as some of you have noted in the chat, it helps to turn things into more action verbs. So if you are like, I want someone to be able to remember what a pre-registration is, right? If they look at something, I want them to be able to recognize that that is a pre-registration. You might start to, instead of saying remember something, you might say something like defining or duplicating or listing or memorizing or repeating or stating, right? If you want people on the other end of things, you want people to actually complete a pre-registration. You want them to be able to do a pre-registration, to be able to fill out a template and to post it on, as predicted, or the OSF or whatever registry you use for pre-registrations. You would use more terms like designing, assembling, constructing, conjecturing, developing, formulating, authoring, investigating, right? So you have all of these different verbs that you can use that actually link on to something that you can actually then observe or measure. So what do you want your learner to be able to do? What is reasonable to expect your learner to be able to do? So those at the bottom of this triangle, this pyramid here, are more foundational. Someone is not going to be able to create things if they don't understand it. So you start with these more foundational verbs, these more foundational objectives, and then you build up, depending on what your audience needs. And so it can also help you to think about what you're going to measure. So as you come up with a learning objective, you think, okay, well, how am I going to know whether this is actually happening or not? How am I going to know whether someone can complete a pre-registration? They will have a completed pre-registration, right? So that's going to be your measure. You'll have them complete a pre-registration. And then you can see, do they do it? How well do they do it? Is it complete? Is it accurate? Is it understandable, right? You can then ask further questions about the quality of the thing now that you know that they can actually do the thing. And then lastly, what does your learning objective have to do with learning? Again, you can have other objectives, but if you're thinking about learning objectives, it should be about learning. So this is just a very quick example of how you might improve a learning objective. Instead of saying learn about t-tests, you might say, I want them to be able to select the appropriate t-test for a given experimental design. So that's very specific, right? It is having them select something. It is, so that's in this understand, right? So then you can say, okay, this is something that I can teach earlier on in a training, right? I want them to be able to select that. Select actually also can fit both for understand and evaluate. So depending on how you're teaching this, you might actually have this at multiple stages, where you're having them learn how to select something, but you're also having them evaluate, like why. Maybe you have them justify, why is this the right t-test? You might, instead of saying having them understand the concept of bias, bias means a lot of things in a lot of different ways. So you might say, I want them to be able to provide the legal definition of bias. So that's a very specific form of bias or specific understanding of bias. And that's a definition. So I'm having them provide them. So you can kind of see, just as I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can kind of see, well, what is it that I actually want them to do? Actually, we'll do one last one. Develop an interest in geophysics. Again, this is something that's outside of your control. And what does it actually mean to develop an interest? Maybe instead I want them to be able to list 3 career paths for somebody with geophysics degrees. Right. So that is something that they can actually do. That is something that I know that they understand. And it's something that's in my control because I can tell them what careers are available to somebody with that degree. I can't make them interested in something they're not interested in. So I'm gonna have you guys now try it out. Um, so I'm going to give you this here. Copy that and put this in chat. This is a helpful little taxonomy verb chart. It shows each of the levels that Bloom uses, and it has a whole list of different verbs that may be helpful here. And so for this, I'm gonna, oh, there we go. So imagine that you're teaching a workshop on open scholarship. It can be a specific practice if you'd like, or it can be on open scholarship generally. I'd love for folks to put into the chat over the next few minutes some potential learning objectives at each level, and feel free to comment on each other's. And remember, this, I'm recognizing we're doing this right off the top of our heads, so they're not going to be perfect. But what are some things that you might expect someone to learn from a training on open scholarship? And it's fine to be a bit creative here. It's very broad prompt. So if you're like, I'd like to focus on open access, you can focus on open access. That's fine. But what are some things that you might expect? And try to use some of the verbs that are in that chart. So I'll give folks a few minutes, and yeah, feel free to list them in chat. Feel free to comment on each other's. If maybe you might have a similar one that you were developing. And again, recognizing we're all just kind of making this up on the fly. Now I've got to define open scholarship principles. Yeah, I can say the question again. If you're giving a training on open scholarship, and you can make it whatever topic you'd like, or you can just have it be like an introduction to open scholarship, what are some learning objectives that you might expect to be a part of that training? So we've got, describing the steps to choose a preprint server might be one. You could also have, for instance, be able to differentiate between a pre-registration and a registered report. That's one I get a lot of questions. So by the way, if you're planning on ever training on that, I get a lot of questions about what the difference between a pre-registration and registered reports are. Yeah, listing components of open science.
I think Crystal will definitely take you up on your offer. Because when we were introducing the SOF platform, we had a lot of no, when we were introducing the open science workflow, we had a lot of questions and concerns about pre-registration. So yeah, I think we'll definitely plan a session ahead.
Yeah, there are lots of questions about pre-registration all the time. Yeah. Defining preprints are knowing and being able to describe their role in research and comparing different platforms. Well, I like that. Comparing different platforms for sharing open access publications, right? So being able to select, and maybe also selecting that what's the appropriate server for me to share. Defining open science, highlighting the benefits of preprints, Yeah, understanding the concept of reproducibility. We might measure that by having them define reproducibility, or if you want to go it a little bit higher, you might have them maybe assess how reproducible a manuscript is or something, right? That would be at a higher level once they really understand what reproducibility is. Characterizing ethical implications of the open scholarship. I also really like that, right? And you have some specifics there: data privacy, intellectual property, cultural sensitivity, also really important. Listing and stating two differences between open scholarship and peer-reviewed journals. Also get a lot of questions about that, so that's a good one. But yeah, you guys got it. Designing open scholarship strategies for institutions. Like that's a really nice one up there at that top, right? Once they've really got a handle on open scholarship, what it is, what the pros and cons are, what the challenges are, and the benefits and the opportunities, you really want them to be able to synthesize all of that information and to design a strategy for your institution. So you guys definitely have it, right? So these are things, right, that you can imagine, even within the ones that you've suggested, people may need different base levels of knowledge to be able to accomplish those things. So if you're starting with an audience that is newer, right, that at that beginner level, you're going to focus on these kind of two bottom rungs here, this understanding and remembering. Because in order to do anything above that, they're going to need to know what it is, and they're going to need to be able to remember it, and they probably need to be able to describe it to somebody else to explain it. Likewise, once people are starting, they've got these concepts down, they're starting to really toy with it, they're trying to learn what are some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the special use cases, right? They're starting to explore that. They're kind of in that intermediate area, right? They're that competent practitioner region. And that's where you want people to start being able to draw connections among different ideas. Okay, well, how does open scholarship fit in with rigor and transparency? You know, they're relating different terms to one another. And then once they've got that confidence and they've got that knowledge, then you want them to go into the advanced session. And so one thing for those of you who might be teaching a course, like something that's several weeks long, you know, maybe as a part of the curriculum, you might have some learning objectives that are in that advanced stage. So by the end of it, you want them to be able to write a proposal for the government for funding. You want them to actually be able to create that. Think about, okay, that's something I want them to do at the end of the 16 weeks or whatever. What are some of the steps that they need to have before that so that they can accomplish that? So you're structuring that in such a way where you have these lower level items that help to build to that higher item. And so that can really help to have some of those goals. And as I mentioned before, you can have secondary goals. You might have things like, I really want people to build a sense of community. I want people to have a network, to have people with like values and like minds. I want them to be able to build a sense of community. I want to connect people with resources. So even if they don't know how to do something, I want them to be able to find what it is that they need. Maybe you want to reduce stigma. You know, I think with an open scholarship, people are concerned, you know, what if this makes me different from my colleagues, or what if there's somebody that really doesn't like this practice? What if I make a mistake? That's often a concern that people have when engaging in open scholarship. And so sometimes that you may have in your training, like you may say, hey, I'm going to tell you specifically ways that I've messed up, so that you can learn from my mistakes, and it helps to normalize talking about mistakes. You might also want to generate excitement, like you want people to be excited about open scholarship. And there may be others, right? These are all fine. They're worthy goals to have. It's just worth noting they're not learning objectives. But that is okay. That does not, learning objectives aren't a special kind of objective in the sense that like you can't have these other goals. I think you can and should have these other goals, especially if you're going to be engaging with a specific community over time. And you should try to measure and evaluate that when possible. But just note that they're not learning objectives, and that's okay. But just note that they're not. A question that I often get is how many learning objectives is too many? And it really depends on your timing, on your audience, on your goals. If they're earlier in that process, you probably want fewer. If you only have a half hour, you probably want fewer. If you're going to be working with a set of folks for over a year, then then you might have more, but you might segment those over time. 3 to 5 is generally seen as reasonable, if you have a reasonable amount of time. And again, this also depends on the complexity of the task. And sub goals are also fine to have. So it's okay to have fewer. It's less advisable to have more than 5. And it is important, and we'll talk about this more next week, that learning objectives actually map onto your training activities and to your evaluation. So we'll talk about that a bit. And scaffolding is key. And so that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. If you want someone to be able to write an entire proposal for government funding, you can't start with that goal, more than likely, unless you have a pretty experienced audience. But if you have like new grad students, first year grad students, that goal, they're going to need some scaffolding. They're going to need some stuff from that lower level of training. And so that actually brings us to where we'll start again for next. I mean, we still have time, so let's chat. But in terms of me presenting, that actually takes us up to next week. So what I would like to encourage folks to do is to think about a training that you might give to a community that you care about. So that could be your department, it could be your lab group, it could be researchers at your institution, it could be researchers in your region or in your field. I'm keeping it intentionally broad. It depends on what your interests are. Come up with 3 to 5 learning objectives for a training that you might give. So you get to pick the topic, you get to pick the level, but like maybe really think about what that community is going to be like. If you think that this community is going to be completely new, maybe you stick to maybe you stick to these lower levels, right? But if you have an audience that you think is going to be more advanced, maybe you kind of do like more of a mix. But come up with 3 to 5 learning objectives for a hypothetical training that you might give, or a training that you're actually planning on giving, and try to use the terms from that chart to make sure that they're measurable and measurable, and related to learning. And then we'll talk about them more next time. But I also wanted to leave some time at the end to just kind of chat about how you all are feeling about teaching other people, mentoring other people in open scholarship practices, things that are on your mind or questions that have come up you haven't had a chance to ask, or if somebody wants to share an experience they've had with teaching in this topic.
I think if I could go first until everyone gathered their thoughts, I think one of the things that me and Emmanuel have tried to do a lot in this training program is, again, reiterating that, oh, we're learning. We're still learning with you. And I think, or I hope that this created a community where everyone is comfortable to ask questions and to engage with the training. And there's something that I also like to do, even though I was explicitly told not to do while I was getting my training to become a lecturer, was that I shouldn't say I don't know. I was told that this really shatters the confidence of your audience in you. But in my experience, I found the opposite. I found that it builds respect in you. So I even do that with my undergrad students. For example, it comes up, a thing comes up, and it's from a course that they had previously. And this course is, I didn't refresh on it for a long time. And I tell them, oh, I don't know. I will come back to you in the next lecture and we'll discuss it. And I don't know, despite being told that this would lead to opposite results, it led to a very positive result in creating a community that is comfortable around each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you shared that, because I found the same when I used to teach undergrads. I now mostly teach professionals like you all, but when I teach professionals, saying I don't know, that's a really interesting question. I would often tell students, like, let me look into that, and maybe I can find something that is about that, because that's not something that I've ever thought about. People kind of like knowing that they've thought about something in a unique way, or that they're asking a question that is thoughtful. So I definitely agree with you there. I don't like that advice of being like, don't tell people you don't know things. I trust people know more who say that what they know and they don't know, right? Or if they're speculating, like sometimes I'll speculate. I'll say like, well, I don't know based on what I know about X and Y, because then you're also modeling, applying, and synthesizing information, right? Based on what I know X or Y, this is what I would expect, but I don't know that for sure. I'm speculating, right? I find that I trust people more who do that as opposed to the person that always knows the answer. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, we've got a hand raised.
Khadija, you can unmute.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to appreciate Crystal for the session so far, Lamis as well. Yes, this is just like a suggestion because I was wondering if it would be better for us to have like a structured program to go by, like something like a curriculum whereby we'll have the different aspects laid out according to the complexity, like maybe having to start with topics that are like the basis of our teaching, and then we go up from there rather than just allowing people choose topics based on their own understanding or whatever, because that will give us a more like a coordinated effort, and then we can also measure our successes together as a group, and then that would help us to make a greater impact rather than just have it in bits and pieces all over. That's just my thoughts. I don't know what you would say to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. I'll toss that to you, Lamis. In thinking we were talking a little bit before this started about what everyone was hoping for from this cohort, after the training ends. And you were talking about wanting to provide support over the next year or so to like help coordinate things. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all. But I think that's a very smart way of thinking about it.
Yeah, actually, me and Emmanuel have already started thinking about that because as we as you guys become LNLs and you go and sort of start educating your community, we wanted to create some sort of standardized materials that you could use. So we've actually started working on some slides on different open science topics, but these are mainly because we know that the community that most of you are going to talk to are still novice in open science. So these are sort of the equivalent to the level 1 of the training, basically giving knowledge and understanding of the different open science topics. So yeah, we definitely had that in mind. But what I think what Khadija meant is for the exercise.
Oh.
I'm not sure if this is what you meant, Khadija. Could you clarify? Did you meant for the exercise that we're supposed to discuss next session, or is it general for the training?
I meant generally.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, definitely for the first level, the introductory level, we'll be able to help with that. But then hopefully, with the help of you guys, we could, as you said, have that like build on the next levels. And of course, with the help of our trainers, because they are the experts in that. So yeah, that's definitely an idea that we have in mind. And thank you for bringing that up, Khadija.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah. So what other thoughts are people having?
I think I also talk a lot, but just in case people don't or still formulating their questions, I think judging from the community that I'm in, I find the most difficult thing that people have when they're trying to give training to others is to go to the level of the audience. I don't know. I always find that this is an issue in many trainings and in many sessions that I've been involved in. I'm happy to say, and I don't know, I think I'm just lucky that I'm able to sort of bring myself down to the level of the audience. For example, in my lab, we have a multidisciplinary team. And during my PhD, I had to give progress reports on my work, and I had to make that relatable. For example, we had people working on media, on social media, who had no clue about what I'm doing. But then I tried to sort of make the information easily understandable to everyone, maybe by linking it to some everyday examples. But I was wondering, Crystal, is there a way to learn that, to learn how to like bring yourself to the level of the audience?
Practice. I think, well, I mean, that's probably I think the flippant answer, but I practice it really, I've gotten better with that over time. But I think also sometimes, so say I'm teaching about pre-registration and I say, okay, I want somebody to be able to do a pre-registration, to do a pre-registration. Well, what do they need to know to be able to do a pre-registration? And then I kind of take that a step back. Okay, they need to be able to select the right template. They need to be able to, they need to know what all the information is, right? They need to, so I start to think about what it is that they actually need to be able to do that. And I take each one of those and I say, okay, in order for them to be able to select the right template, what do they need to know? And then in order for them to do that, what do they need to know? And in order for them to do that, what do they need to know? And often it ends up being like the very first thing is they need to know what a pre-registration is. Like that's the very first thing, that like they can't do any of this other stuff if they don't know what a pre-registration is. So once I start to get to that point where I'm like, they need to know what a pre-registration is, I can see, and it's usually quite a long list because it goes kind of in different directions. I can kind of start to think about what does my audience probably already know? And I can maybe circle some of those things. And then I can also say, okay, what do they almost certainly not know, right? And I might circle that in a different color or something. And then I can kind of get an idea of what information I can maybe skim over. Maybe I have it prepared, but I can say, if we all know what pre-registration is, right? I can just kind of remind people quickly, right? Pre-registration is blah, blah, blah. And I can focus in on the stuff that I really think that they're not going to know. But it's kind of that working backwards from what my end goal is. If my end goal is I want them to be able to complete a thing or to do a thing, what do they need to know to do that? Okay, what do they need to know to do that? And I kind of just work backwards from there. And so like an example for this, if you're comparing, say, first-year grad students and sixth-year grad students, right? What do they need to know to be able to do it? And can they know it? That's going to be, by the very nature of grad school, very different between a first-year and a sixth-year grad student. So a sixth-year grad student has probably written, if we're doing like funding applications, they've probably written scientific prose by the time they're in sixth year. They've probably read several articles. They've probably maybe even applied for some grants already on their own, right? I can start to really think about what are some things that this group's probably already done. And that doesn't mean that you don't talk about it at all, but maybe you only spend 5 minutes on it instead of 15 minutes on it. And so I think kind of engaging in that practice is where you're like, what do they need to know? What does that need to know? And moving backwards can really help to kind of focus where you're at. But I honestly, my honest answer is it takes practice. You'll give a training. Gosh, the first couple classes I taught, I would hate if there were recordings of those out there. But there's practice. You'll get questions during your lectures. You'll get questions during your trainings that surprise you, right? Or that can indicate like, oh, I'm speaking at a little bit too high of a level. I need to take a few steps back, right? And so you can do that. But it does take practice. And so there are going to be trainings where you go through that training and you're like, I don't think that went too well. And you'll feel that way sometimes. And that's okay. But as you do it, and the more comfortable you get with it, and the more you start to understand your audiences and where their concerns are and their questions might be, it comes a little bit more naturally. But if you're doing it in a structured way, I like starting at the top and then kind of working my way back and then trying to figure out what are the things that I need, because that, if I know they need to know these base things and they're not probably going to know that, I know that goes in my presentation first or in my workshop first.
Yeah, that's excellent advice, to be honest, because I don't know, I've never had it somewhere. As you said, it came with practice, but it's sad that there is no like actual training out there. Like, for example, your training today, there are things that we thought of a lot, but I think when you have something written in like a presentation and presented to you, it makes things more organized in your mind. So yeah, I think that this is a brilliant idea. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I hope this was helpful for folks. I know we're at time. I want to be respectful of your times. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if folks have questions. I have time. But if you have questions, feel free to ask. But next week, come with 3 to 5. And I'll send an email out to remind folks. But come with 3 to 5, and they're drafts, and it's a hypothetical training in a topic that you're interested in. And we'll kind of work through what adapting course materials and what planning that looks like based on those. And so again, you're not tied to them. They're just hypotheticals. But thanks for coming. And Musa, hi.
Okay, hi, thank you, Crystal and Lamis. And I have just one maybe questions based on, like, we are going to teach our community about open science and other related issues. Like, if the plan is to prepare teaching material at central level and then distribute to local network leader, and maybe some how we are going to customize to our societies, maybe some, because we do have cultural differences, and how we can customize, and maybe are we going to share that back to maybe RN, or is that going to be placed at the local level? That's my question. Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. I will say, well, that is what we'll be talking about in a good part next week. So in terms of doing it for like your own training as a general practice. But yeah, maybe Lamis, you can speak to what Erin might be planning in terms of, I can speak to what I do in my own training, but I guess I can do that first. So I actually have a document for all of my trainings. So I have folders, and I mean, I can share that structure if anybody's interested in doing something that's more systematized. And I've shared that also with Lamis in a manual. But I have a document for me personally where I say, like, here's what my general training looks like. Here's what the learning objectives are. And then I actually have like a table that says, like, if speaking to this audience, these are the changes that you might want to make and why. And I do that mostly because you probably, I hope, you won't be working on this alone. You'll be working with it in a network. So I don't work by myself. I work at an organization where we're all doing this work. I'm the primary trainer, but my documentation on, if I'm talking to qualitative researchers, instead of talking about this, I'll talk about it in this way. And this is why, because qualitative researchers, think about research in this way. So it's a 3-column table. And then being able to have that documented somewhere, I can then share that within my organization. And then if they're talking to qualitative researchers, whether they're giving a training or not, they can know, okay, if I'm talking about pre-registration to qualitative researchers, I might want to use this strategy instead of what my normal strategy is when I'm talking to, say, somebody in the biomedical sciences that's doing lab work. So that's something that I do like as a general practice, but maybe Lamis, you want to talk about what that might look like for Erin specifically?
Yeah, for us, it's the idea of having these slides prepared is just to help you, to help the LNLs, because we know that you're already doing a lot and preparing a lot. So just having some slides ready, for you to go on, we thought that this would be helpful, but definitely they will be open for you to customize, according to their community. We're even hoping after the end of the training program. And even now, we had some trainees who, for example, Joseph and Zoe, because their community speaks French, it's difficult for them to understand English very well. So it would be great, for example, if you could help us translate these slides to other languages, local languages, if you think that it would be more helpful than English. So yeah, definitely, Musa, it's going to be customizable. It's just there as a resource to help you guys sort of navigate the training, and also, as I said, to sort of standardize. We want, there are certain information that we want to make sure that all of the communities that you're engaging with will know and would have. But then definitely there are other, for example, information that you might think are not important, or maybe you could change the examples that are in the slides. So these are definitely going to be customizable according to your preference. Yeah.
And so then is the idea then to share those customized training materials back to Erin?
Yeah, definitely, because at the end, you guys are the first cohort of our LNL training. So for example, if the next time we have trainees coming from your same country or your same discipline, they might find it useful, to have your slides there that are more customized to the community that you're presenting to. Yeah, so definitely, yeah.
Thank you very much, Lamis and Crystal. Thank you.
You're welcome, Musa and Joseph. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay,
So yeah.
then. Yeah. Go ahead, Crystal.
Oh no, I'll leave it to you, Lamis.
Yeah, so yeah, Joseph. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll definitely be sharing the slides, and yeah, as Crystal said, the slides are in the OSF project that she created, but I will also download it and upload it to our Google folder for everyone to access. Yeah, and I think if there are no more questions, we could close the curtains on this session, and looking forward to seeing you, Crystal, again next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to next week.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Au revoir.
Okay, bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.